Hey everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to finally start looking at the Berlin Endgame, or the Berlin Wall, as it's sometimes referred to, and that arises after the following moves. So, of course, this is the Ruy, this makes it a Berlin, although at the point where the Berlin starts, there's still the possibility of transposition to other variations, as we've already discussed, to the classical, as well as even to an open Ruy, but here we go. So now we're in our Berlin endgame. And what I'd like to do here is to give a quick overview of some of the maneuvers that you're liable to see, some of the maneuvers and plans that you're liable to see in the Berlin, in this endgame. Or queenless middle game, perhaps, would be a better, more accurate way of referring to it. So it's certainly not an endgame in any pure sense. I mean, attacks are still possible. There's plenty of complications that can arise. So it's a little bit early to call it an endgame. But, okay, it's not a traditional middle game either by any means. Anyway, so I'm going to show some of the standard ideas and kind of go through maybe unit by unit for both sides and discuss some of the possibilities. And then in the weeks to come, we'll look at some of the variations. Okay, and one other thing I want to do is I'll close this, hopefully I'll remember to do so, with a look at a very poor but quite natural approach for white from a player who hasn't seen this before. Okay, so let's get started, and let's go through this one at a time. So, first of all, white's rook on a1. Okay, what's its future? Well, the most natural thing for this rook is to go to d1. So that's pretty obvious. It'll take some time though, but that's its most natural future. Okay, how about this knight on b1? What's it liable to do? Well, there are two places where it's likely to go. One is, of course, to e4 via c3 most of the time, but sometimes it'll go to d5. So there are various times where black will want to play c6 to c5, in which case white will put the knight very often on d5, especially because black does not want to push this pawn to c6, as that can often weaken a number of squares. So you'll sometimes see, for instance, white playing a knight to e4. Black plays the pawn to c5, which is useful for him for a number of reasons. One is that it supports the d4 square, which allows the bishop to come to e6 without worrying about knight to d4 possibilities. And also, sometimes this bishop may be fianchettoed, either artificially or directly. So you can have that. So once c5 happens, then this knight from e4 will sometimes drop back to c3, and then still go to d5. Finally, one other idea for this knight, sometimes it'll go to e4, and, okay, generally g5 will be off limits. If it weren't, this knight would have already gone there. But sometimes it might come to g3 to try to displace this knight. So that can also happen sometimes. Okay, let's move on. How about this guy? What do we do with this? Well, it's not clear what its best prospects are going to be. Sometimes it goes to f4, and from there, let's say after h3, or maybe h3 has already occurred, there are occasions where it can drop back to h2 and then help, in some cases, with a general kingside advance. That's one thing that can sometimes occur with that bishop. Sometimes it goes to g5, although very often you'll see black having played h6. So that's not so common. In fact, here I can already discuss, though, that idea that I wanted to mention. So one very natural approach that white players might be tempted by is to play, bishop to g5 check, and after, for example, king to e8, to play rook to d1. So all this looks quite natural and obvious and all of that, but in fact this is helpful for black, who will play bishop to e6. h6 is part and parcel of black's agenda anyway, very often is happy to play that to take the g5 square away from the white knight. And indeed, the white rook on d1, it's the wrong rook there. The bishop on g5 does absolutely nothing on that square except throw away a tempo later on to h6. And of course this erroneous continuation can arise with rook to d1 check first, king e8, and then bishop to g5. Okay, so those are a couple of squares the bishop can go to. f4 can be quite alright. G5, generally not so good, especially because the most likely time for that to occur is pretty much right away, and that'll help black. Much more common is to play b3 and bishop to b2. And this can sometimes work very nicely in conjunction with e6 in some cases to really pry open this diagonal, especially if black has played h6 and sometimes g5. And this sometimes does happen. Black will sometimes play this to get his bishop from f8 into the game, and also to help stop white's kingside expansion. So g5 is relatively rare, but not extremely rare. It does happen fairly regularly. Okay, so finally this rook. It can go to d1, and sometimes does, but e1 is a more natural square for it. Now, I will say something about the combination of this rook going to e1 and this knight going to c3, which is that white wants to be a bit careful about this, because if black plays bishop to b4 and swaps this guy off, the resulting opposite-colored bishop, well, again, ending, late middle game, whatever it is very, very difficult for white to bust. And you might want to look up this old game. I forget which computer it was that Anand played. I think it was against Rebel. Anand was black. It's in the late 90s, maybe very early 2000s, but I think it's in the late 90s. And Anand just tortures this poor computer and destroys it with black in just such an opposite-colored bishop situation in the Berlin. Definitely worth checking out. I might even present that in a subsequent show. So white wants to be careful not to allow that. But eventually the rook is very likely to arise to reach e1. Okay, how about this knight? This guy on f3. Well, black's knight will often retreat to e7 and g6, and in such cases, but he'll also have played h6 most of the time. In such cases, this knight will go to d4 when it can, especially if a black bishop is sitting on e6. So that's an exchange that white is generally very happy to make. There are lines where where black does put the bishop on e6, allow its exchange, but those are lines where black is just playing for a draw and not aiming for anything positive, anything more ambitious than that. Okay, so and sometimes, okay, if black doesn't play h6 or plays h5 later, this maneuver is also possible. So it's not just the b1 knight that can go to e4, but sometimes the f knight, the f3 knight that can go there. Okay, pawns, how about them? Well, this pawn doesn't usually move, but sometimes it can go to a3 to stop bishop to b4 and in support of b2, b4. Likewise, the white pawn can go to b3 to enable the fianchetto, but sometimes does go to b4, and the point of that is to prevent black from unraveling his queenside. In particular, c5 is often a very useful move, as I mentioned, both for the fight for d4, and also to make possible this light squared bishops being able to achieve and to be posted on this great long diagonal. So b4 can be very good from that standpoint. Okay, the c pawn rarely moves. Sometimes it goes to c4, but generally not, and it's usually best at home if it can stay there. Okay, the white king side. Okay, this pawn will sometimes go to e6, as I said, when the bishop's on b2 to open the long diagonal. Very famous game, Kasparov-Kramnik from Astana in 2001. Kasparov won with just such a motif. Okay, this guy, okay, it's very difficult. It takes quite a long time, but if someday white can play f4, and again, this is often in conjunction with some generalized kingside advance, then he's in great shape. But as I said, it proves very difficult to do this. It's a long-range plan. This pawn will not usually move for quite a while, but h2, h3 is in fact fairly commonly seen. In part as okay, occasionally it could be prophylaxis against a bishop going to g4, but it also introduces the possibility of playing g4, and again, starting this kingside advance. So it's not that it's necessarily going to happen right away, but it at least makes it more possible for white to do it, and black has to pay attention. Okay, so now let's talk about black's forces. Where are they all going to go? Okay, well, the first thing we'll start with is the black king. All right, so there are, of course, lots of other black pieces, and we just went left to right from white's point of view, but I think for black, it's most important to discuss what the king is up to, because really that's going to decide the disposition of the other forces. So there are two basic directions that can go. It can go to c8, not right away obviously, or it can go to e8. And e8 is most common, but I'm a fan of the c8 plan. I think it's the most ambitious try for black, and if black can achieve it, if black can get the setup that he wants, and with white not having done anything special, then I think black is really in very good shape. And that's what I played when I was trying the Berlin a few years ago. There's an old show that I did. I think I called it The Exciting Berlin, and I actually meant it seriously. And I show a win against, I believe his name was Stivelband, an Ohio master, played in, I think, late 2008. Anyway, I used just such a plan, and it worked pretty nicely. I mean, there were some inaccuracies by both sides in the game, but it was overall a pretty logical game, and it showed the plan. So if you're going to put the king on c8, then the bishop goes to d7. Okay, generally you play h6 to stop knight g5 annoyances, and the king goes to c8. You play b6, and you try, if you can get it, to play king b7, c5, king c6, and then this rook is ready to jump to d8. So black is achieving really quite nice play in this variation. Again, unless white manages to thwart it. So that's one approach. Okay, the second approach is just to put the king on e8, and this rook will still end up going to d8. And then the problem for black to solve is, what does he do with this rook? Okay, so sometimes it just sits there for quite a while. Sometimes black will play, again with h6, can play for g5, the bishop goes to g7, and he hopes someday to play king to e8 and put the rook on e8, or maybe to double it on the d file. Alright, so it really depends. But it's a fundamental decision. Do you go to c8, or eventually go to c8, or to e8? Okay, well, having discussed that then, let's discuss other pieces. This black bishop on c8 will almost always end up on e6, again with the exception being the bishop d7, king c8 plan, where it hopes to at least reach c6, although very often there too it ends up on e6. Okay, to play this you need to play h6 first, so that's why h6 is a very, very standard move. Alright, now h6 stops knight to d4, stops knight to g5, but what about knight to d4? So there you see another point behind h3 and g4. When the bishop goes to e6, you can have the g4, and then knight to d4 can happen, trying to bother the black bishop. And in such a case, the black bishop could retreat. It could go to d5. Sometimes it can go to c4 with tempo. But when this bishop moves, then e6 ideas come into play. And if white has also played the rooks to the central files, I mean, you can see that e6 could be even more annoying and upsetting. Alright, on the other hand, if white plays h3 and g4, so he can play knight to d4, one drawback is that then, even if there's a pawn on h6, it can still come later to h5, trying to undermine the structure. So then, with especially this bishop, if it's surviving on this diagonal, it's putting pressure against the g4 pawn and the pawn on h3. If white plays something like g5, well, not only would the h3 pawn potentially be hanging, but then f5 would be a gaping and permanent hole for black pieces to use. So there are these little battles that go on back and forth between white trying to push black back, but if he does, he can overextend. And again, as far as the knight to d4 plan is concerned, a pawn on c5 can help thwart that, but putting a pawn on c5 gives up the d5 square. Okay, so that's the black light squared bishop and the black king. Okay, how about the other bishop? Well, this guy will go to one of three places most of the time. e7 is very, very common. Sometimes, again, as I mentioned, after h6, there can be g5 and bishop to g7, which at least has the asset of, or has the positive point of putting pressure potentially on the e5 pawn, which in turn could keep the white knight on f3 at least relatively immobile. And then a third point, which I mentioned earlier, is that sometimes this bishop can come to b4, at least if it can exchange for a knight on c3. So that can especially happen if the knight's on c3 and the rook's on e1. Okay, that's its future. The black rooks. Now these have different things can happen. Sometimes they go to a central file, but also sometimes they take the elevator up. So h6 is sometimes played, very commonly played, but this pawn also ends up on h5 with some degree of regularity. Now again, the drawback of that is that it gives up the g5 square, most frequently for a knight. And alright, how will black defend that? He can defend it with the bishop on e6, but it allows its exchange. Again, that can be, well, it creates a situation where black is only fighting for a draw then. Alright, the bishop could defend the f7 pawn from e8, but then e6 becomes more possible. You can have the king, of course, on e8, and that's perfectly normal. Still, you always have to be careful of e6 breaks. So that's the downside of a pawn being on h5. But on the plus side, it prevents white from playing this h3, g4 advance, or at least it makes it very difficult. Well, it doesn't make h3 difficult, but it makes the g4 part tough. And also this pawn can even continue all the way to h4. And one possible advantage of that is that it can allow the rook to h5, bringing it into the game, and from there it can sometimes put pressure against the pawn on e5. So that development scheme does sometimes occur. Alright, likewise for the other rook, it's rare, but sometimes a5, a4, and rook to a5 can happen. So there are alternative paths, but generally the rooks enter the game via the center files. But again, thanks to the awkward black king, it's usually one rook that gets to enter, and the other one has to really wait quite a while. Okay, finally, this knight on f5. What does it do? It looks like it's on a really good square. You might think that, and in fact it's not a bad square certainly, but very often there's this peculiar looking retreat to e7, and from there the knight goes to g6. I should point out that there are certainly times, there was a recent Ivanchuk game, Nisipiano against Ivanchuk, played in the Bosna tournament that just finished. And in that event, Ivanchuk brought the knight to e7 and to g6, and then a couple of moves later did an about face and went to e7 and then to f5. So all of these kinds of goofy maneuvers can occur depending on where the white pieces are, how, if at all, he's progressed with his kingside play, and again, it just varies. Sometimes also the knight can come to e7 and occasionally go to d5. That's fairly rare, but it has happened before. And of course, there are occasions where after c5 the knight might go to d4. So all of these ideas are possible. But knight e7 g6 is really the most common maneuver out of the bunch. Well, what does it do? What exactly is the point of this? Well, one idea is that now this bishop is freed up, and it could come to f5 or even to g4, kicking the knight away. On g6, the knight can come to f4, and that's certainly effective if white has played a fianchetto plan. Of course, it's also putting pressure against the pawn on e5. So there are a number of things that it does that are quite useful. And still one other idea, get rid of all that stuff, with the knight on g6 is that there's also the possibility of bishop to e7 and knight h4. Now, of course, you can just have that right away, too. You don't need to make that retreat. And that's another line that is sometimes played nowadays. I think it's lost some of its popularity, but there was a period around 2008, maybe early 2009, where that was very, very popular for black, to play bishop to e7 and knight h4. All right, so I think we've covered all of the black pieces. And, okay, the pawns, okay, I already mentioned this guy goes to h6 sometimes to h5. This pawn often stays at home, except in an h6 g5 plan. The f7 pawn never moves, except to recapture a bishop on e6 on some occasions. This pawn does move to c5 with some regularity. Again, the key issue is timing. When black does do this, he wants to do it in a situation where the white knight has at least left c3 and will have to waste time going back to get there. This pawn from c7 very rarely moves, again because it's quite weakening, and also because black plays c5, not always, but quite often, to, again, open the long diagonal for the bishop. So if you play c6, you're shutting it back down. The b6 pawn, okay, I can't think of any occasion where you'd want to play it to b5. I mean, at least no foreseeable occasion. b6, on the other hand, makes some sense. Freeing the diagonal, shoring up the pawn on c5 if it's there. And again, this pawn from a7 will sometimes go to a4, especially if white has played b3, because then the possibility of a4 exists, trying to break up the white pawn structure on the queen side. All right, so a lot of general information here. It'll become clearer, I think, in the context of seeing some of the particular variations. But I hope this at least gives a little bit of a flavor of how the play can go. As I said, a great deal of flexibility is required. So, both sides really are going to react to what the other guy does. I mean, there's no, with the exception of, again, the bishop d7 plan, and even there, but in general, I mean, there are very few occasions where one side or the other can just go for a certain setup and pay almost no attention to what the other player is doing, and just try to enforce a plan, whether the opponent is trying to combat it or not. It's just not possible in the Berlin against a reasonably well prepared or an opponent who's reasonably well prepared and has a good understanding of the system. Okay, so you have to be flexible. That's part of what makes it a very good weapon. I mean, if you're able psychologically to be flexible, to pay attention to these nuances, and to try to figure out what your opponent is up to, and to frustrate his plans. If you're that kind of player, if you have this kind of prophylactic mindset, the Berlin can be a fantastic weapon. If not, then it's not the opening for you. Okay, and that's part of the fun of this. I mean, many players who play 1e4 are very direct, like forceful play, and the Berlin is, it's an eel. It's slippery, it's slimy, it's not easy to just grab a hold of. So, I think it's a good practical weapon too. So I think it's a good system and a practical system as well. But that said, as we'll see, white still, just like any other mainstream opening, the burden of proof is on black to prove equality, and white should not certainly be worse and has chances for an edge. So we'll take a closer look at some of the plans. We'll look at one plan per show, perhaps. So I think next time we'll start with the bishop to d7 plan that I mentioned in the old show, and I'll kind of take a look, see how the theory's gone in the meantime, and then we'll look at other plans where the king usually goes to e8 instead in subsequent shows. Okay, so this is kind of a short one, but I hope it helps to lay the groundwork for what's to come in the next few weeks. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.